In our previous film Ivan the Terrible, we talked about how after the ascension of the Romanov dynasty to the Russian throne, Russian history was completely rewritten. Not only was the interpretation of historical events in the second half of the 16th and early 17th centuries fundamentally changed, but also the biographies of the last czars of the Rurik dynasty. Traditional history assures us that the Rurik dynasty ended with the death of childless Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, and the absence of direct heirs became the reason for the cruel struggle for the throne. But it appears, this historical version is incorrect. In this film, we will tell you the true reason for those tragic events in Russian history that later became known as the Time of Troubles. Historians believe that the Time of Troubles began in 1598 after the death of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich. Due to the absence of direct heirs, power in Russia was passed from hand to hand for 15 years. However, according to the authors of the new chronology, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, the Time of Troubles in Russia began much earlier, in the time of Ivan the Terrible. That is, in the middle of the 16th century when power in the country temporarily fell into the hands of the Zakharyin-Romanov clan. For almost 10 years, the Zakharyin-Romanovs dealt with their political opponents, chief amongst them, all members of the royal family. This period went down in history as the time of Oprichnina. Despite their defeat, the Romanovs continued to fight for the throne, and 50 years later, the first Romanov ascended to the Russian throne. And the two last rulers of the Rurik dynasty, Boris Godunov and false Dmitry, were declared by the Romanovs as illegal rulers, impostors on the Russian throne, and all the troubles and crimes committed in Russia during the Time of Troubles were blamed on them. However, the documents and testimonies from that era tell a completely different story. So who really were Tsar Boris Fyodorovich Godunov and false Dmitry I? For centuries, historians have spoken of Boris Godunov as a random person at the pinnacle of Russian power. It is believed that it was his illegal rule that became the main cause of turmoil in the state and allowed false Dmitry I to triumphantly enter Moscow. But was Godunov's power really illegal? Let's turn to authentic historical facts. It is known that in 1591, during the reign of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, Boris Godunov received a letter from Crimean Khan Gazi-Giray.
This letter is usually called the Letter of the Crimean Khan to Boyar Boris Godunov. However, the letter itself is written in Arabic and has a translation on the back. In this translation, a Moscow official wrote the following words: "The letter is addressed to Tsar Boris Fyodorovich from a close person of the Crimean Khan, Akhmad Aga." Thus, even during the reign of Fyodor Ivanovich, letters addressed to Boris Fyodorovich were marked as letters to the Tsar. Therefore, I emphasize that the annotation on this letter was made right at the time the letter was accepted. It was not a later annotation, but a note made right at the time the letter was received, due to the fact that it was being translated from Arabic into Russian.
This record sharply contradicts the Romanov version of Godunov's biography. It turns out that 7 years before the death of Fyodor Ivanovich, in a genuine official document, Boris Godunov was called not a boyar, but a tsar. However, while the sovereign was alive, calling someone else a tsar could only be done if that person was his heir. Such was the custom of the Moscow tsars, to name their son the Grand Duke and Tsar even during the lifetime of the reigning monarch. This custom came to Russia from Byzantium. For example, when Boris Godunov's son Fyodor grew up, he too was called Tsar and Grand Duke. An example of this is the solemn inscription made in 1600 under the dome of the Ivan the Great bell tower in the Moscow Kremlin. By the dispensation of the Holy Trinity, by the order of the great sovereign Tsar and Grand Duke Boris Fyodorovich, autocrat of all Russia, and his son, faithful great sovereign Prince Grand Duke Fyodor Borisovich of all Russia, this temple was completed and gilded in the second year of their reign. Here, Godunov's son Fyodor is called the Great Sovereign, just like his father. It turns out that Boris Godunov was not the brother-in-law of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, but his son. The Gazi-Garay's letter is not the only indication of Boris Godunov's royal lineage. Unfortunately, after the Romanovs came to power, many documents confirming the nobility of the Godunov family were destroyed. But some evidence has survived. It is believed that the founder of the Godunov dynasty was the Tatar prince Mirza Chet. He came to Russia during the reign of Ivan Kulita and was baptized under the name Zakharyin. While on his way to the capital to serve the Tsar, Chet stopped in Kostroma, where he founded the Orthodox Ipatiev monastery. Later, the monks of this monastery wrote the tale of Chet. Today, this ancient Russian literary work is the only written source that tells about Mirza Chet. Historians consider this source to be unreliable. In their opinion, the monks of the Lost in the Russian Wilderness Monastery allegedly deliberately composed a fairy tale about the genealogy of the Godunovs to historically substantiate the princely origin of Boris Fyodorovich. Today, historians cannot deny the existence of the tale of Chet. However, since the history written by the monks contradicts the traditional historical version, they declare that this document is full of inconsistencies and therefore it does not deserve even a bit of credibility. But the authors of the new chronology believe that the ancient Russian monks did not make anything up.
There was a time when Kostroma, which is located very close to Yaroslavl, was the capital of the great Russian medieval empire. The old Russian dynasty emerged from there, and the Godunovs traced their ancestry to a Kostroma boyar who served Ivan Kulita, who created the great Russian medieval empire through a great conquest. Therefore, historians are wrong to criticize the Ipatiev chroniclers. They were absolutely right.
However, historians prefer not the chronicle records, but conjectures that are not supported by any documents. For example, that Irina and Boris Godunov were children of some unknown landowner named Fyodor Ivanovich. Historians consider the list of 1,000 best servants of the sovereign as evidence of the obscurity and insignificance of the Godunov family. According to Ivan the Terrible's decree, dated October 1, 1550, the highest class of service people, 1,000 best or chosen servants, was established in Russia. They were all brought from the provinces and endowed with landed estates in the Moscow region. These new Moscow nobles formed the upper layer of the service people, as we would say today, the state elite. However, neither Fyodor Ivanovich Godunov, the father of Boris and Irina, nor his brother Dmitry, are on this list. Based on this, historians conclude that the Godunovs' ancestors never had any relation to the Moscow court and were generally upstarts. However, for some reason, Fyodor Ivanovich chose to marry Irina, the daughter of an unknown landowner Godunov, rather than a girl from a noble family close to the throne. Another interesting fact is that Boris Godunov lived in the royal palace from early childhood, meaning he grew up at court. And Irina was raised in the royal wing from the age of 7. If their ancestors, the Godunovs, had no relation to the Russian nobility, it is entirely unclear why unknown children from a declining family were brought to Moscow and raised as noble boyars. Historians cannot explain this.
In our opinion, Boris Godunov's ancestors were Russian czars, not some lowborn, unknown landowners. Fyodor Ivanovich was Boris Godunov's father. So naturally, Boris could not be mentioned in the list of his own best servants. The royal chancery did not write nonsense. Later, when the Romanovs began to write their version of history, the authentic documents about the origin of the Godunovs and their dynasty were destroyed by the Romanovs and their historians.
Historian Skrinnikov, recognized by his colleagues as a great expert of that era, in his book Boris Godunov describes the arrival in Moscow of the Austrian ambassador Nicholas von Warkach, whom Boris Godunov invited to his court. Interestingly, the ceremony of meeting the ambassador was the spitting image of a royal audience. Guards stood in the courtyard from gate to gate. Boris's courtiers were dressed in gold-embroidered dresses and gold chains. The Austrian ambassador kissed Godunov's hand and presented him with a personal message from the emperor. From this description it is evident that Godunov received envoys, that is, he clearly performed the functions of the Tsar. And this was done while the Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich was alive. Historians explain this by saying that Boris simply usurped power in the country. It is also believed that he appropriated a lot of titles that he used in his dealings with foreigners. And foreigners, in turn, allegedly deliberately called Godunov other people's exaggerated titles. But at home in Russia, he was referred to not as a czar, but much simpler, a ruler. Where did this strange title come from, which never appeared again in Russian history? Historians took it, for example, from the letters of Boris Godunov to the English diplomat Jerome Horsey, in which Godunov allegedly called himself the ruler of all Russia. Skrinnikov also cites this example in his book Boris Godunov. But most likely, the word ruler appeared due to an incorrect back translation from English to Russian of the usual Russian words, "By the will of God, sovereign of all Russia." By the way, the English Queen Elizabeth I in her letters to Godunov called him beloved cousin. At that time, this is how sovereigns of different countries addressed each other in a kindred way. If Boris Fyodorovich was just some kind of ruler, the English queen would hardly have addressed him in this way. So there were no mysterious rulers in Russia, only sovereigns and czars. And the strange position of ruler was most likely invented by Romanov historians to conceal the true biography of Boris Godunov. Historians claim that the supposedly childless Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich did not leave a will, and after his death, a fierce struggle for the throne broke out. However, the same historians write that according to the official version of those years, there existed a document in which Tsar Fyodor designated his wife Irina as his successor on the throne, and for Boris to inherit the kingdom in his spirit. Therefore, Boris was indicated as the heir in the official document. Historians do not trust this version because it came from the Godunovs themselves. They also find incredible the oath that subjects were supposed to swear to the new ruler. From the point of view of traditional history, such an oath looks strange. The subjects were forced to swear allegiance to Patriarch Job, Queen Irina, ruler Boris, and his children. At that time, such an oath would have caused confusion among the subjects at best, and could have ended in rebellion because people only swore allegiance to the new Tsar. What does some ruler Boris have to do with it, let alone his children?
In our reconstruction, there is nothing strange here. The country swears allegiance to Tsar Boris, the son of the deceased Tsar Fyodor, and his children, that is, the royal children.
That Boris Godunov did not just perform some royal functions under Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, but was his legitimate heir, is evidenced by another fact. Historians believe that Boris Godunov's rise to power occurred even under Ivan IV the Terrible, who considered his son Fyodor completely incapable of governing the state. So before his death, Ivan the Terrible made a will in which Fyodor and his family were placed under the care of the members of the Boyars' Council whose names were listed in the will. For a long time, historians believed that Tsar Ivan placed Boris Godunov at the head of the Council of Guardians. But when examining the documents, it turned out that this was not the case. Boris Fyodorovich Godunov's name is not mentioned at all in the will. There is also nothing said in other official papers about what positions Boris Godunov held at the court. There is information about the high positions of Dmitry and Stepan Godunov, but nothing was said about Boris.
All these peculiarities can be easily explained by our reconstruction. Boris Godunov did not hold any positions because he was the son of the Tsar and the Tsar's heir. Moreover, he was already considered the Tsar, so naturally Boris Godunov did not hold any lower positions.
There is another reason why Boris Godunov's name could not appear in official documents regarding important state decisions. Boris was too young. Being the son of Fyodor, he had not yet reached the age when the heir to the throne is involved in serious state issues. Although historians claim that Godunov was born in 1552, it is more likely that this date was invented by the Romanov chroniclers. If Boris Godunov was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich, then he could not have been born earlier than 1579. It was in this year that Fyodor married Irina Godunova. Therefore, when Godunov ascended the throne, he was not 47 years old, as historians claim, but significantly younger. This version is indirectly confirmed by the images of Boris Godunov that have survived to this day. In all portraits, he is depicted as a young man. Boris's age also explains his father Fyodor Ivanovich's will. Since Boris was still too young at the time of his father's death, Tsar Fyodor bequeathed his throne to his wife Irina, who was to become the regent for the heir to the throne. But the kingdom was still left to Boris. Almost everyone knows the canonical story of how Boris Godunov was persuaded to accept the crown. It is well known, for example, from Pushkin's poem Boris Godunov. Supposedly, after the death of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, Boris pretended to have no interest in the affairs of state and even went to a monastery. But the people and the boyars begged him on their knees to become the Tsar, and he stubbornly refused, saying that he had no right to the Russian throne. However, in the end, Godunov yielded to the people's pleas and agreed to become the Tsar. This version, as we know, was invented by the Romanov historians. But there is another version based on foreign sources, written by eyewitnesses of those distant events. One of them was an Austrian named Mihail Schill. In his notes, he didn't write a word about Boris refusing the throne. On the contrary, he accepted it as a matter of course. According to Schill, Godunov said that he would take on the management of the state, and the dukes and boyars would be his assistants. Certainly, compared to the vivid picture invented by the Romanovs, the Austrians' testimony seems very banal. But if there really was no story of begging Boris to become Tsar, why did the Romanov court historians feel the need to invent it? Most likely, to emphasize the supposedly illegal election of Boris to the throne. The authors of the new chronology, Gleb Nosovsky and Anatoly Fomenko, believe that the Romanov historians deliberately distorted Boris Godunov's biography, depriving him of his rightful title and family name. One of the reasons is that during the reign of Tsar Boris Fyodorovich Godunov, the family of the Romanov boyars suffered serious persecution. The Romanov brothers were accused of the most serious state crime, attempting to assassinate the Tsar. The punishment for such a crime could only be death. Boris hesitated for a long time, not knowing what to do. In the end, the Tsar showed leniency towards the conspirators, and none of the Romanov brothers were executed. The eldest brother Fyodor was tonsured as a monk and was exiled to a northern monastery under the name Filaret. Alexander, Mikhail, and Vasily were sent into exile. The Romanov party and the Boyar Council was also destroyed. It is not surprising that after the Romanovs came to power, the court chroniclers spared no ink to describe Godunov's villainy and to present the Romanovs as martyrs. But this was the revenge of the Romanovs, and the main reason was different. In our previous film Ivan the Terrible, we told the story that according to the research of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, the Romanov historians deliberately merged the reigns of 4 Russian Tsars of the 16th century under the name of one ruler, Tsar Ivan the Terrible. This deception was necessary for the Romanovs to justify their right to the Russian throne. But in reality, in the 16th century, 2 dynastic branches were formed in the Rurik dynasty: the ruling branch and the branch that was removed from power. The direct descendants of Tsar Ivan IV the Terrible and his wife Anastasia Romanova belonged to the branch that was removed from power. Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich, who died at the age of 10, his younger brother Ivan Ivanovich, and his son Dmitry belonged to this branch. In 1572, Tsar Ivan Ivanovich was removed from power. He was replaced on the throne by another representative of the Rurik dynasty, Simeon. Thus, a new ruling dynastic branch appeared. The descendants of Tsar Simeon Ivan belonged to this branch: Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, his son Boris Fyodorovich Godunov, and Godunov's children, Fyodor and Xenia.
The Romanovs belonged to the branch that was removed from power. Their rights to the Russian throne were justified solely by their relationship with Ivan IV. Therefore, the Godunovs became a real obstacle for the Romanovs on their way to seizing the Russian throne.
A conspiracy was organized against Tsar Boris, led not only by the Romanovs but also by the Shuskis and Golitsins, who also dreamed of the monomach's cap, so Godunov was poisoned.
Tsar Boris died on April 13, 1605.
Here's how it is described in the documents. At 1 o'clock Godunov was in the Council of Boyars, the Boyar Duma. Then, he had lunch and had barely got up from the table when he felt ill. Then blood gushed from his mouth and nose.
2 hours later the Tsar passed away.
The next day, Moscow swore allegiance to Boris Godunov's 16-year-old son, Fyodor. But his reign was short-lived. The conspirators were already preparing popular unrest and the coronation of false Dimitri. On June 10, 1605, a frantic crowd led by the conspirators, the Shuskis, Golitsins, and Romanovs, burst into the royal chambers of the Kremlin. The young Tsar and his mother were strangled and buried without any honors. All relatives and supporters of the Godunovs were captured and executed. In December 1606, the remains of Boris Godunov, his wife Queen Maria, and son Fyodor were transferred to the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. In 1622, their daughter Xenia was buried there as well. Today, their tomb is located on the west side of the Assumption Cathedral of the Lavra. One of the members of this Boyar conspiracy against the Godunovs was a man whom historians call False Dimitri. Over the centuries, the Romanov historians have done everything possible to associate the cruel murder of the Tsar's family of Boris Godunov not with the Romanovs, but with false Dimitri I, who was also called by these same historians the Pretender. But in reality, this is not the case. Probably, the prefix false appeared much later than the described events. Most likely, he was the real Prince Dmitry, but not the resurrected son of Ivan the Terrible who supposedly died in Uglich, but rather his grandson. The conspirators simply used Dmitry to clear the way to the Russian throne. Historians say that the personality of false Dimitri is an unresolved mystery of Russian history.
Researchers of the time of troubles still do not understand why Dimitri was convinced of his royal origin from childhood.
Why was he raised in the family of the Boyars Romanovs, and then sent to a monastery where he was ordained as a deacon? And why did this unknown deacon first flee to Lithuania, and then dared to appear before the Polish king Sigismund and call himself a prince? And the king, instead of sending him away, on the contrary, allowed him to recruit an army and even gave him money for this. Evidently, all this is incomprehensible if one considers this man an impostor, as historians do. But most likely, they are mistaken. Official history claims that the real Prince Dmitry was the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible and his last wife, Maria Nagaya. It is believed that he supposedly died in Uglitch in 1591 at the age of 10. Both the grave of the boy and documents of the investigation into this case existed. But there is one very important fact. The investigation into the death of Prince Dmitry was carried out personally by Vasily Ivanovich Shuisky, who led a conspiracy against Boris Godunov. Even historians admit that the documents in this case were most likely falsified. At a cursory glance, there are obvious signs of hasty processing. The pages of the investigation are cut, glued, and assembled in the wrong order. And Vasily Shuisky changed his testimony several times. Therefore, there is an opinion that the preserved materials of the investigation are a final draft written in Moscow. And the drafts of the interrogations, drawn up at the scene of the events, have not survived. And it is not known for sure whether the boy existed at all. In our previous film Ivan the Terrible, we talked about the fact that Ivan the Terrible had only one son by the name of Dmitry, and he died not in 1591 but much earlier. And the man whom Shuisky and Romanovs declared an impostor was actually the legitimate heir to the Russian throne. Dmitry was the son of Tsar Ivan Ivanovich and the grandson of Ivan IV the Terrible and Anastasia Romanova. From birth, he was raised in the family of Romanovs. But when in 1572 Tsar Ivan Ivanovich was removed from power, Dmitry was tonsured as a monk and sent to a monastery.
However, after some time, he escaped from the monastery, gathered troops in Poland, and started fighting for the throne. Later, when Shuisky ascended to the throne and false Dmitry was still fighting, it was advantageous for Shuisky to present false Dmitry as a pretender to the throne. Otherwise, it seemed that his opponent had more rights to the throne than Shuisky himself. A false version was created for purely political reasons that it was false Dmitry, and the famous Uglitch case was created, in which, incidentally, Shuisky had the most direct involvement. He signed everything there, as is known. And later, when the Romanovs came to power, they supported this version, and it was advantageous for them.
It is precisely the royal origin of false Dmitry that explains many details of his biography that seem strange to historians. When Dmitry had just began his struggle for the throne, everyone who saw him recognized him as a prince. Polish aristocrats, Russian boyars, and even the mother of the supposedly deceased Prince Dmitry, Maria Nagaya, who had become a nun named Marfa, all acknowledged him as the prince. On June 1, 1605, Dmitry was crowned Tsar, and on July 18, he met with Marfa in the village of Tanaskoye near Moscow, with a large crowd in attendance, and settled her in the Ascension monastery of the Moscow Kremlin. Witnesses said that Marfa was surrounded by exceptional attention and care, and Dmitry, as a truly loving son, visited her every day. Another interesting fact is that false Dmitry was so confident in his royal lineage that he never feared exposure, including by the Poles. After his coronation, he boldly moved to aggravate relations with King Sigismund. He was not afraid of his own. Just a few days after Dmitry's coronation, based on a report from merchant Fyodor Ivanovich, it was discovered that Prince Vasily Shuisky was plotting against the new Tsar. He was spreading rumors in Moscow that Dmitry was not actually a prince, but rather an unfrocked monk named Grishka Otrepyev, who planned to destroy churches and eradicate the Orthodox faith. Shuisky was arrested, and his fate was decided by the Council of Boyars, the Zemsky Sobor. According to surviving documents, Tsar Dimitri was so eloquent and so skillfully accused Shuisky that the council unanimously sentenced the traitor to death. On June 25, 1605, Shuisky ascended the scaffold, but by the order of the Tsar, he was pardoned and sent into exile in Vyatka. If Dmitry had feared exposure, he would not have missed the opportunity to get rid of the man who personally headed the investigation into the so-called Uglich tragedy. But Dmitry did not do that. As time showed, his action was very imprudent. The murderers of the Godunovs themselves sought the throne, and in less than a year, they succeeded in a coup, resulting in Vasily Shuisky ascending the throne.
Fyodor Romanov, who was tonsured as a monk, was returned from exile.
Once he himself dreamed of the royal throne, now Fyodor was elevated to the rank of Moscow Patriarch. Such a quick overthrow of the new Tsar suggests that for conspirators Shuiskys, Golitsins, and Romanovs, Dmitry was only an intermediate figure. It is believed that the conspirators killed Dmitry, otherwise Shuisky's coronation would have been impossible. But some evidence from that time suggests that this was most likely not the case. The first thing that causes confusion is the burning of the supposedly killed false Dmitry I's body. In Russia, neither friends nor enemies burned corpses. The enemy's body could be dug up, desecrated, but not burned. But Dmitry's corpse was burned. However, at first he was so mutilated that it was not only impossible to identify the murdered Tsar in him, but even to see a human image. And in such a disfigured form, the corpse was presented to his mother, demanding his identification. They asked her, "Speak, Queen Marfa, is this your son?" Historians give several answers from Marfa. According to one version, she did not recognize her son, and according to another, she answered very evasively. But most likely, Marfa was shown the body of someone else, not her son. To prevent her from exposing the conspirators, the body was first disfigured and then burned. The fact that the so-called false Dmitry survived is evidenced by the fact that false Dmitry II appeared on the historical stage. The subsequent events only confirm the assumption that the conspirators usurped power in the country while the legitimate Tsar was still alive. There are even fewer reliable records about false Dmitry II in history than there are about false Dmitry I. It is practically impossible to create a complete picture of those events based on genuine documents. But one thing can be said with certainty. The man whom the Romanovs called the criminal of Tushino had no less weirdness around him than his predecessor. The same crowds of people who in 1605 recognized the real prince in false Dmitry I also recognized the new false Dmitry as the real Dimitri. Perhaps it was not difficult to deceive the crowd. But the lawful wife of false Dmitry I, Marina Menishek, also recognized her husband in the new pretender. After false Dmitry II approached Moscow and stopped in Tushino, Marina and her father also came there. Historians claim that Jerzy Menishek agreed to publicly recognize his son-in-law in false Dmitry only after the impostor gave him his word to fulfill the promise of his predecessor to pay Menishek 300,000 rubles and give him the Principality of Seversk with 14 cities. Supposedly, only after this, under the pressure of her father, Marina agreed to play the role of false Dmitry's wife, but only for show. However, this assertion of historians, to put it mildly, does not correspond to reality. How else can one explain that soon after, Marina gave birth to a son by false Dmitry II, whom the Romanovs named the Little Criminal? In other words, they recognized him as the son of the criminal of Tushino. It would be more correct to assume that neither Marina nor her father pretended and sold their recognition for mythical gifts that they might not have received if this new Dimitri were an impostor. Most likely, there was no false Dimitri II. It was still the same legitimate Tsar Dmitry, who, having gathered an army, marched on Moscow to punish the conspirators and traitors who had seized the throne. But, as historians believe, he did not succeed. And in December 1610, false Dmitry II was killed. Historians cannot explain Marina Menishek's behavior after the death of false Dmitry. They do not understand why Marina did not leave rebellious Russia and continued to fight for the throne with the help of her loyal troops. Why, having been widowed, allegedly for the second time, did she not flee to her homeland in Poland, saving herself and her child? Perhaps because Marina knew who her husband really was. She knew that she was the real queen, and her son was the legitimate heir to the Russian throne. That is why Marina did not go to the Poles, but to the Cossacks on the Volga, Don, and Yaik. That is why she fought for the Russian throne, which rightfully belonged to her son, and not to the conspirators Shuskys and Romanovs. And here, on the historical stage, Romanov historians bring out a certain Don Cossack named Ivan Zarutsky, who supposedly led the Cossack forces, first fighting on the side of false Dmitry II, and after his death, for Marina and her son. The history of Zarutsky and Marina's war with the Romanovs is one of the most obscure periods in Russian history. Most likely, the description of this war was completely fabricated by the victorious Romanovs. After all, there are testimonies that Zarutsky also called himself Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich. He received petitions and complaints under this name. And this is a very strange fact. It turns out that he was the third false Dmitry. Why did Zarutsky do this? Who did he want to deceive? His Cossacks, who knew him for years, or the people of Moscow, who repeatedly saw the real Tsar Dmitry?
Most likely, it was not some unknown Cossack ataman Zarutsky who fought for the Russian throne with Marina Menishek, but Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich, her husband, who was still alive at that time. However, the Romanovs certainly could not admit that they were actually fighting against the legitimate Russian horde Tsar. They claimed that they were fighting against Cossack forces. And for this, they announced that their leader was a certain Zarutsky, behind whom there was just Marina Menishek. It is possible that there really was an Ataman Zarutsky in Dimitri's army, who fought with him against the Romanovs. But then, when the Romanov historians crossed out Dimitri's name, only Zarutsky's name remained, along with Marina Manishech's.
When Dmitry and Marina's troops were defeated, the Romanovs managed to split the Cossack Union. The legitimate Tsar fled with his family to Yake. But there they were caught by the Romanov troops and brought to Moscow. The usurpers of the throne, the Romanovs, dealt with the family of the last Russian Tsar of the Rurik dynasty no less cruelly than with the Godunovs. In 1614, Tsar Dmitry was executed. The conspirators impaled him on a stake. It is not known for sure how Marina died. According to one version, she was hanged, according to another, drowned. It was also said that she was imprisoned in the round tower of the Kolomenskoye Kremlin, where she died prematurely. Obviously, the Romanovs did not spare Ivan, the little son of Marina and Dmitry. The boy was the legitimate heir to the throne and he could not be left alive. The Romanovs publicly hanged the 4-year-old child on the Spassky gates of the Kremlin. The time of troubles became not only the beginning of a new stage in Russian history, the beginning of the rule of a new royal dynasty in Russia. This era became the end of the Great Russian Empire. With the fall of the Rurik dynasty, Russia lost for a long time the position in the world that it had held for about 400 years. Huge territories in the west and east were lost forever. Even with the emergence of the Romanov Empire in the 18th century, Russia did not regain the power that it had in the past. In its history, a series of wars, internal strife, and confrontation between the parts of the once unified empire began. But the main tragedy of Russia was that for many centuries it was under the rule of people of Western origin and pro-Western orientations. The centuries-old history and culture of the Russian people did not represent any value for them. Moreover, it was even dangerous. Future descendants, both in Russia and beyond its borders, should not have known the true history of the ancient empire or the truth about the people and events that destroyed it. Therefore, immediately after the Romanovs' accession to the throne in Russia, systematic work began to falsify the history of the Russian state. Composing a new version of the world's historical development, the Romanovs' henchmen destroyed everything that did not correspond to this version. Ancient Russian culture lost a huge number of monuments of literature, applied art, and painting.
Unique architectural structures were destroyed.
The entire centuries-old way of life of the Russian people was destroyed. You can learn more about this in our next film, The First Romanovs.